I'm the worst. I triple book myself frequently.
Okay, so I'll do that. And Toby and Ann, if you, since I have the most recent version, I made a few changes after you guys approved it, and I changed the cover slide to blue. I will go ahead and share. We didn't like make a presentation to really make a presentation, but it was the easiest way to share the information I think that we wanted to talk about today. So this is a follow-up meeting to our conversation last month about coexistence between various types of pesticide users and the cannabis industry as a whole, both hemp and marijuana. So when we say that, it's kind of that umbrella term. And what we understood the group to be saying was, please come back with kind of drill down into the information about what cases ODA's pesticide enforcement program actually had that related to this topic. So we went back and looked at our fiscal years 20, 21, and 22. And for the pesticide program, those are from July 1st through June 30th. So fiscal year 20, correct me if I'm wrong, Anne, would have started July 1st, 2019 and ended June 30th, 2020. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And these are cases that were closed during that time. So the case may have been started a year previously. It could have been started a month previously. It kind of just depends on the situation. And then if there's a violation, we don't close the case until that violation is closed out. So sometimes that can take a little bit of time. And then, like I said earlier, cannabis is going to include both hemp and marijuana. So with that set up, Toby, would you like to talk about the next two slides at least?
Oh yeah, sure thing. So we thought we'd start by putting, I guess, cannabis in the scope of everything we do, which our team does a lot of different things. So, so these are closed cases by each fiscal year. And then we pulled out the cases that were related to cannabis. Oh, did you have a question too, Jeff?
Yeah, just to help me level set, because I feel like I'm all over the place. So are these any of these complaint driven?
Yes.
I mean, I just want to try to figure out what is
We're gonna-
compliance versus complaint.
And we're going to drill down to complaint specific.
Okay, but these numbers are aggregated?
Yes, this is
Okay.
everything. Yeah, this is record inspections, dealer record inspections,
Okay.
marketplace inspections. This is our producer establishment inspection. This is the universe,
Okay.
if you will.
So not just off-site related, it's
Right.
everything.
Everything. Yes.
Thank
This
you.
is, yeah, we figured we'd start with the universe and we'd kind of come down, and ground ourselves here. So we're kind of starting big and coming down. So just to kind of show you, I guess, again, the big picture, complaint driven stuff sent from OLCC to us. So it's everything. About, this is kind of showing you for these closed cases each year, around 15%, 12% relate to cannabis. So that it is definitely a chunk of work, I guess, to start with. And then would you want to go to the next slide, Sunny? Yeah, my computer is really slow. I'm guessing is it on the, okay, there it is. I was kind of like, my computer just goes so slow. Okay, so kind of getting to that next level. So we're going to get into complaint even further down here in a sec. But so when we get into, let's just kind of now move to just those cannabis cases, taking that slice of the pie. So is it marijuana or hemp? It's a question we kind of threw up here. And so majority of when we talk about cannabis, majority of the cases we handle involve marijuana versus hemp. And this kind of shows you broken out by fiscal year. Again, this is complaint. This is this is some of the stuff that's sent from OLCC to us as referrals and followed up that manner. So this is the universe of cannabis divided by marijuana and hemp.
Can I just jump in? I have the impulse control of a refrigerator magnet. So
Yeah, you're good.
I just looked for base causes, and I remember when the rulemaking was being done on cannabis, and let's just say the disjointed nature of it, the label and being able to use certain products on certain elements. I would also remind you that at that time we had people with chain of custody, which is also difficult because you have some things that will go to edibles versus inhalation, and you really have to be. I mean that part, that oversight really needs to be carefully done because if you recall, Colorado had someone that it got diverted and it went to children and old people, and it turned into cyanide when it was
Right. Right.
inhalated. So
Myclobutanol.
yeah, I mean,
Elon's
and you know
world.
that's when I mean I had the Colorado exec call me in a complete panic. I said, well, um, the cover up's worse than the crime. Fix it though. So
So long,
I'm just wondering if all those I just try to right size how much of this is just going to get resolved with pesticide use when cannabis is legalized versus, and then the labels catch up. I'm
so
just
a couple things
maybe that's
along
just
there.
maybe that's just a stupid question, or 4 slides from now, and I should just be quiet and patient.
No worries. I will jump in. So on the marijuana side, they do the seed to sale tracking through a system called Metric. And so when that plant material goes from a grower to a processor, it typically is tested for 59 pesticide active ingredients. It doesn't always have to be. If it's going to be smoked, it absolutely has to be tested. And then um, a large percentage of what you see here are those cases where somebody has a residue on there that's above the action level, which, if we remember those conversations, Jeff, it's not a tolerance, right? Because the all of the products, all of the active ingredients except for one on that list, which the Oregon Health Authority established, are illegal for use on cannabis of any form. Pyrethrins and piperonyl butoxide are the exception. There are pesticide product labels that ODA has evaluated and determined that we would not consider to be illegal for use on cannabis, given how broad the label language is.
Doesn't it have like a name, a special needs analysis, something like that?
No,
Is that what that is?
no, a special local needs is a
Oh,
different
okay.
process. Basically, what we've done is we've gone through every pesticide product that's registered for sale in Oregon. First of all, determined, has the EPA at the federal level exempted it from the requirement of a tolerance? So something like pyrethrins, they exempt from the requirement unless it's like used on dried, already harvested materials. But when it's used on the crop in the field, it's exempt from the requirement of a tolerance. And then basically the label language has to be broad enough you can drive a truck through it, is the way I look at it. Green edible crops. That could include cannabis. And so we've said, and we put together a list of products that meet that criteria. It's available on our website, and we call it our pesticide guide list. If it's one of those products, we would not consider that to be illegal if they used it according to the label directions. So if it gets tested and entered into Metric, and it's either above the action level or somehow it were something, some of the labs may run a screen that includes more than the 59 active ingredients. That gets entered into Metric. OLCC pulls that data and sends it to Toby's program. And then Toby's staff reaches out and says, Eland, looks like you had a bad day. What's going on? And if it's their first time, we have that marijuana or hemp compliance assistance program, because we're trying to get folks to do the right thing. And many of them are new to ag. And so rather than shut everybody down and drive ourselves crazy chasing our tails, we said, okay, you can go through this compliance assistance program. You're going to meet with one of our investigators. We're going to go through everything you have on the farm. We're going to talk to you about what's legal, what's not. You have to watch worker compliance make sure all of your employees go through worker compliance training. Somebody on the farm needs to pass either the private or commercial applicator test, even though they're not required to have that license, but demonstrate to us that you now have basic knowledge. And anything that is contaminated would have to be destroyed. But then we also document everything that they have on the farm at that time, so that if it gets tested and they fail again, we give them a buy because it was before we came out and met with them. Anything after that, now they're subject to our full enforcement program. And then the other piece is they agreed to a violation. It goes on their record and they don't contest it. So if they get typically 3 violations in a 5-year period, it can result in more, it goes up to potentially a civil penalty versus just a black mark on your record. So I would say, and Ann and Toby, I apologize because I kind of took over, but most of this information that we see here in the green are going to be those referrals from OLCC. And many of them are still pyrethrins. We don't know why pyrethrins aren't breaking down quickly on cannabis like they do other crops. But the studies that EPA does is on something like spinach, right? It's really smooth, the leaves are flat and out, it's not curly, sticky, etc. So even though pyrethrins is a naturally occurring chemical that breaks down very quickly in sunlight, they're not having that same experience on the cannabis. And so in that case, we would still do a similar process, reach out to them and say, hey, Toby, it looks like you've got some pyrethrins, and do you want to contest that? And so Toby's staff work with them, and if they can show that they used a product that was on the ODA guide list and that they used it according to the label directions, they have a couple of options through OLCC. We report back to OLCC saying they didn't violate our rules. OLCC will either allow them to hold that material and let time help break the pyrethrins down. I think some folks have exposed it to UV light, some folks have exposed it to ozone, and then they're allowed to retest. And if it's below the state action level, enter the marketplace. Those are the only chemicals that they allow them to retest on, because we didn't want them to use dilution or time or something else to bypass state and federal pesticide law, right? So that's kind of where the state ended up, and we've continued to do some of those NCAPs. I think we've had a few repeat offenders, but in general, I think it's been a really good program, and it gets people talking to us. They realize that we're out here and that they need to be aware of what they're doing. So with that, let's drill down though into those that weren't those referrals. And Ann, I don't know if you want to explain what was going on here.
I was kicking it to Toby.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, so that was a great description too, Sunny, by the way, of the whole thing. And a great lead up to this one. So kind of shaving off all that stuff that we just talked about, we just referred to them here as OLCC referrals. So we again started with the total cases, how many of those are cannabis, how many of the cannabis are marijuana versus hemp. Now let's jump into kind of where we started with that initial question about complaints. And so here's on the right here, in fiscal year 20, we had 8 of those cannabis cases that started with via complaint, 21, 11, and 4 and 20. Oh, we got a typo there. So 4 in 2022. Yeah. So I was like, well, I'm doing a circle. So those are the 3 years, 20, 21, and 22. And the bottom one's 22. And then of those cases, how many were in violation, we kind of flagged, because not everything that comes to us as a complaint goes directly to a violation. I mean, we start the process and go through it to see what happened and is there a violation of state law. So we kind of teased them out that way. And then I want to thank Ann so much for sitting down and reading some of these cases to kind of come up with some tables here. This isn't just exported from any database. This is, thank you, Ann, for taking some time. So each of these next 3 slides is kind of jumping into what's going on, if you will, on those years. And so kind of some of the questions we threw out on the table were like, you know, who made the complaint? What were the concerns revolving around the complaint? And was there an enforcement action? So we kind of tried to, you know, sum up a whole bunch of information here. But in general, most of the complaints that came in were from growers, actually. We did have a couple that came our direction that were, we didn't have the information from the source. A majority of the complaints involved drift, but there was other stuff, you know, dumping pesticides, water contamination. But in general, it was concerns about drift. We did have a case with exposure there. Ultimately, we had one in that set of closed cases that led to a violation for offsite deposition or drift. And the rest were basically went through the process and were closed out. And then for the next fiscal, there were more in this one here. We had 11. In general, again, complaints came in from growers, concerned cannabis growers. We did have some in this one where, you know, we had one from workers on a road. We had homeowner. And see, is there a geographic component? Not sure if we teased that out, Ann.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, what are you looking for?
Is
Jeff
there,
asked if there was a geographic component to where these were occurring.
I did not include that. I certainly could. But no, it is not included in this data. I have that data if you want it.
well, the only reason I ask is if, you know, it's really only for edification, but it's also for, you know, potentially how do we do outreach? And is it a certain extension office or something like that that could be helpful? That's the reason I asked. And also want to see if, you know, people are just pissed at the cartels.
Yeah. As I said, it's not included here, but if we're going to be looking to outreach down the road, that could be very important information to pull out. And I can snag that out of the database that we have.
Cool. Thank you both. Yeah, so again, kind of similar concerns revolving around drift, neighboring applications. This year, when we went through the enforcement part, though, the ones that were closed out with enforcement weren't necessarily drift or off-label use or anything. It was licensing violations. So, you know, part of the conversation, hey, what are you doing? Do you need a license? That led to those this year.
Was that more of a because they're new to growing a license, or was it because they didn't think they needed something from a biopesticide standpoint?
Um,
I see Ann's hand up here.
Part of this here is a lot of times the violation here is someone who is doing maybe an aerial application or a field application. So these are often more knowledgeable and they're fully aware they should, but their license lapsed or something like that. So a lot of times here, what you're looking at is just forgetfulness, inadvertent, but they do know. The other thing I wanted to point out was where it says that it couldn't be confirmed. Often what that means is they complain of drift. We take biological samples, we run tests, and when it comes back, either we get a no detect or we get it so low we can't be confident in what we found. So that doesn't mean that there was no problem. It means what they think they saw wasn't necessarily we weren't capable of documenting it. But sometimes what it also means is people smell something and they think that means it hit their crop, and it didn't necessarily. So the test that it's not a violation means we could not confirm it. We couldn't go to court and say, yes, we found this. So that was it.
Also, Anne, isn't it frequent that people don't notify us maybe as quickly as we need in order to be able to confirm? Because some of these chemicals, it either rains or it breaks down quickly. And so the small amount that could have resulted in offsite deposition. Because they didn't contact us, we weren't able to get out there quick enough to document it too.
And sometimes if you're not walking those fields all the time, you don't see the damage for a month. And then it's like, well, we can't pull the chemistry out a month later. So that becomes a problem too. So it's the length of time that has gone by and the environment that it's in makes a difference.
Thank you.
And if it's a license violation, aerial spray, most of the hemp growers or marijuana growers aren't doing that themselves. They're contracting with somebody and they're required to have a license. So that's where those license violations show up.
And then for the last fiscal, we pulled out data. We had here we've got 4 kind of similar growers concerned. This year, this set was driven pretty much. And we had 2 of those that led to violations with offsite deposition or drift. We had one actually here noting an illegal marijuana grower. If we have one that comes to us that's an illegal grower, we do not go on that site. That's referred to law enforcement. Yeah, we're not set up for that. So those we will hand over.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much the data we pulled so far. I wrote down the one question for if we go further about the geographics. But is there any other questions or thoughts or?
Well, I was trying to remember the origin of this question. It may have been Marianne that had asked about, drilling down, or maybe somebody else. But when I look at this as a whole, it's a lot less of a deal than I thought it might be, given focus and time. And not saying we shouldn't be spending our time on it, but there was less there than I had expected to see by a lot. So by drilling down into this information, does this inform us in any way as far as next steps? And like, Jeff had asked about the geographic focus when we talk about education, that sort of thing. But just what would your kind of conclusions be after looking at it in this way?
Actually, I would like to say something there. One of the things that came up with when we were dealing with grape and grass seed was that a lot of people weren't reporting to us because they thought we wouldn't do anything, or for whatever reason, they didn't bring it to us. And so making a point of telling the growers, if you don't tell us as far as legislation or anybody else is concerned, this didn't happen. It has to be documented. And so we got more reports the following year. I mean, the numbers all went up. So that was good. It meant more communication in the group itself, but it also made it clear that we do respond. We will come look. This is an opportunity to get on the record and to have this examined. So part of this, yes, the numbers are low, but actually most people think our numbers are a lot higher than they are. We have very good compliance in this state. We really don't have a lot of bad actors. People are very good. The farmers are very good. So this is more really kind of in line with other problems that we have, like crossbow. So that's the other thing. It isn't huge, but we don't have huge problems in our state. We usually do a pretty good job of education and communication. So the numbers might go up if people realize that we will come out and examine and take samples and do an investigation. So that's one thing to think about. That kind of communication, improving that.
What's the challenge? And I'm thinking grape versus looking at cannabis. If you've got a herbicide drift or if you've got an insecticide drift, kicking over the crop and not allowing it to go into the sale, and is that a deterrent for people wanting to call you guys in to do an analysis? Because I think about grapes, it's the grape itself, so it's a lot different than curly leaves because of 2,4-D or whatever, but it's the leaf, right? I mean, how does that play into this?
I I think that's a
challenge about
valid,
getting people to report.
yeah, I think that's a valid question / concern, is that that may be true. And I think earlier in the season, folks may be more likely to hope that it'll grow out of it and not show up on the tests by the time it's harvested and dried and sampled for the test. I think if it's later in the season, we probably would get more complaint, because they're if they're thinking about it, they're like, oh, it's more likely to show up in my tests than earlier in the season. So I think that's part of it. Earlier you had asked about conclusions. I think with Anne's comment, my brain goes to, maybe we should do or could do some more outreach to the cannabis industry as a whole, of not only are you subject to these pesticide laws, but everybody around you is subject to these same pesticide laws. And so, you know, ODA is available not just to come bust you for misuse, but to be a tool if you think that your neighbors are not using their products appropriately, and you know you need to work with ODA. And so there might be some education and outreach around both. You need to prevent drift, but also if you think you're subject to drift, you need to call ODA sooner rather than later. And I know OLCC would use their email listserv to do that, and I have one as well for the hemp side of the house that we could use to get that kind of information out, and then see in a year or two. I mean, so taking a step back, we have a pretty known universe for marijuana. They have a license moratorium for the next 2 or 3 years established by the legislature this year. So they're not getting any, I mean, they can sell their business, and so we'd get new people in that regard, but otherwise they're not getting new licenses. And the hemp market, because Oregon is a cannabinoid market currently, has taken an extreme nosedive in the last year and a half. So we're down to like maybe 300 growers, and I don't see that number increasing next year. I only see it probably going down again a little bit more. So our universe is getting pretty well known. And so we could put that information out there, and in a year or two have a much better idea, you know, is this something that we need to attack with more vigor, or is this something that we just remind them every once in a while, hey, ODA's over here, and you know, everybody, you're a farmer, you're subject to the same laws as any other farmer or pesticide applicator in this state.
So can I ask a couple seemingly I know I can, but may I?
Go for it, Jeff.
Oh, okay. So I'm not surprised. It was like a gold rush, right? And everybody wanted to come in. And not all folks who came into the light are actually good business people. And so there's that aspect of it. But I look at it through a couple of different prisms. I mean, certainly the nursery license apparatus is a good one to mirror long term for cannabis. The license and inspection program, which pays for itself. I've long advocated, and actually, Elin, this is something I wanted to talk to you and some other Aggies about, is that I don't think cannabis on the growing side really should be at OLCC. You don't have wines. You have wine sales going through OLCC, but you don't have the grapes going through OLCC. It's not what they do well. And so my sense is that if we can develop a program that is more akin or uses similarly structured thing like you have with the nursery side, you can have a program that is self-sustaining and does not put ODA in that pickle. And it is a fee for service, right? For especially for the licensing and inspection program. So it's something I'm interested in doing long term, and looking at how do you redefine it and actually give the growing part to the ODA. And then when it starts getting processed to whatever degree that it is processed, then it moves over to the other agency. I've told this to OLCC that they wouldn't know good planting from a hole in the ground, and that's no offense to them. That's not what their gig is. But I also want to look at overall, kind of how do they access reasonable BMPs? So not only on the pesticide side of the equation, but the good practices, good neighbors aspect of it. I mean, certainly we've had many arguments in the nursery industry that have resolved themselves because we had ODA being a fair umpire calling balls and strikes. So that's just one thing I want to say, I guess, out loud, because if this should ever get inertia, and it's not been on the top priority side of it because I haven't really seen it being ultimately broken. But I do worry about ODA's ability to continue with the role that they should have on the growing side. So just food for thought. But I did want to signal that that is something I would love to talk to you guys about how to frame that.
Thank you for that, Jeff. And I would just note that the hemp program itself is fee for service. The license fees have to pay for the hemp program. And so ODA does have rules out for public comment right now that would double those license fees given the reduction in number of licensees.
Well, keep in mind that when on the nursery side, if the program is not meeting where it needs to go on the financial side, ODA comes to us and says, "Hey," and we had to revamp the program because it had been like added on to like a house. It had no flow.
Sure.
And so we worked together with ODA to get that done. And also it's a lot easier if the industry goes and say, I want to tax myself more for this program, then, because the nutty buddies will come out saying that you're just increasing fees.
I appreciate what you're saying, Jeff. I don't want to go down too much of a bunny trail, but what is the resourcing for the marijuana growing side for OLCC? How do they charge? And what are they doing even?
It's license fees as well.
Okay.
And they do inspections. They look at the information that folks are entering into that metric seed to sale tracking system and looking for anomalies. They do some economic forecasting ish a little bit. But yeah, it's a lot of it is both programs now have some pretty extensive background check requirements. And so it's doing that. So there's a lot of paperwork. The marijuana program requires that the local municipality approves the location of that facility. So they have time, manner, place regulations for marijuana that we don't have for other agricultural crops, including hemp. We do not have that for hemp for growing. So they have a lot more hoops they have to jump through. They go out and make sure that they have video coverage of the facility and that they're maintaining the backups, both on and off site kind of stuff. So, and their license fees, last I checked, I think were like $5,000 for the largest tier because of all
Sonny,
those
that makes sense. I just want to let you know that place and time thing by the counties is problematic. I know not everybody wants cannabis, but we're seeing that now extended like chicken farms. I'm on some stupid. I mean, we're recorded, right? So I'm on some wonderfully enlightening work groups with Senator Dembro, and so people are really coming out like in the NIMBY train
Mm-hmm.
on the chicken farm, and now it's properly permitted, mind you, by ODA, but they're using cannabis as that anvil to try to tank that operation.
Yeah.
So I
And
just want you to know that that's also something we may have to. I mean, that's going to come forward by hook or crook in some manner. But we haven't had a family meeting, Marianne, I don't think yet on on kind of what to do about that. But I just wanted you to know that, I mean, it was a trigger for me because I had to spend 2 lovely hours with that yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. So Marianne and Giovanna, thank you for joining. We are recording this so you can go back, folks can go back and listen. We kind of went over the data and it's minimal for how many non-OLCC kind of referrals, welcome Jenny, that came through. So I think what we're maybe coming to, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn here for other folks, but is that we might be better served to educate the umbrella cannabis community, that not only are they subject to these pesticide laws, but so are their neighbors. And the ODA needs to be made aware sooner rather than later if they think that they're having concerns. And then we could revisit this discussion about how much outreach and communication needs to be done, because we'll see, are those numbers increasing or are they kind of staying low, middle? Since we've kind of have a known universe right now on the marijuana side, because there's license moratorium for the next couple of years. And I think the hemp side isn't going to increase much in the next year or two as well. Marianne?
Sunny, and I'm not sure this is something for this group as a kind of labeled coexistence group, but I just wanted to, and I can follow up with you offline about this. And I'm gonna say this wrong, but I think you're gonna know exactly what I mean when I say it. The point that John Iverson raised last time around kind of what the points at which in the system for processing, I think he was talking about him, that the testing will kind of kick it out if there is a pesticide concern, and having it be, you know, maybe the testing occurring at the wrong place in the production line, because what the end user is getting has nothing you can detect, but at some point otherwise in the product line you get a detection.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I'm getting at? And because I'm kind of trying to say it as vaguely as possible, because I don't really know what I'm saying, but I know John mentioned it last time.
I was going to say Giovanna can describe it as well.
I had actually sent Sunny an email as a side note on this. And so I will say to the group too, you know, part of what was also addressed in the last meeting is that there may be, you know, it may be coming from dust blown in as well. So identifying the source is going to be one aspect of it. Communicating with our neighbors, which we have done extensively at this point, is another aspect. But the other huge factor in this is in-process testing. There are EPA levels for, say, peppermint tops versus peppermint oil. There's a pretty significant increase in what is allowed in process versus something on the other side. So, you know, look at the toothpaste industry. Like here's a model for that. How and who and where do we start that conversation? I've been involved with IR4 conversations for the last year and a half, 2 years now. That is, it's kind of, they're figuring out their systems as well. I think there's a lot of education that can happen on that part, but their focus has been primarily on just getting things cleared versus what happens in the middle. So we are a GMP facility, but I represent the Iversons. However, I also consult locally in Oregon and nationally. And at this point, we have seen it on outdoor grows. We have seen it in greenhouses. We have seen it on indoor grows. Somehow it's with vented systems. So it's hitting every angle of both hemp and marijuana at this point. And that's where I'm hoping to figure out, you know, I'll start just throwing rocks and buckets, but how do we get to a source that may help start changing this for the industry? Because it's a lot of loss at this point for something that isn't going to show up on the other side.
So
can I ask a follow-up question? Do you mean getting at it in terms of like stopping the problem from like figuring out what's causing it and stopping the problem from happening in the first place, or more changing some of the regulations to recognize that there's kind of this weird phenomena happening and maybe changing a point of testing or something where you have the ability to effectively process out?
Changing in process levels.
Okay,
Tolerances, essentially.
you.
A tolerance on the, yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, it does.
So-
Sorry, Sunny.
No, that's okay. Let me address that a little bit. Giovanna, from my perspective, you kind of brought up two things. And one will benefit the hemp industry before it benefits the marijuana industry. And that's the EPA looking at products on the plant material. IR4 is starting to do some of those studies to be able to get products registered that include hemp as the crop, as opposed to the pest, right? There's a few herbicides that probably Ann knows about from her time in Kansas for ditchweed, right? But that process is ridiculously long and expensive, which is awesome that IR4 is working on that, because that's part of what they do, right? Is work with specialty crops and get stuff that would be hard to get otherwise. So that's kind of one piece, right? Is that federal recognition and acceptance and labeling and actual establish of tolerances. So far, the only products I think that IR4 has approved are exempt from requirement of a tolerance. And then you've got the testing piece, and that can vary from state to state. In Oregon, back in 2018, they tied the testing to the marijuana testing for hemp, so that they're now the same requirements. And as you and I talked about in the email, that's through the Oregon Health Authority. And so if you want to decouple or change that process at some level, decoupling would require legislative action. Changing the testing process would require working with Oregon Health Authority, because they are the ones that establish all of the testing requirements and where products are tested and what those levels are for both hemp and marijuana. Marianne.
Is it common? Oh, sorry, did I jump in front of Elin?
I think you're okay.
Okay. Is it common? Is it done with other other food crops, et cetera, for OHA to set tolerance levels for pesticides? And if not, how does that ordinarily happen? Is it? I don't know as much about it. I see multiple people shaking their heads who apparently do. So if this isn't a good use of everyone's time, we can move on.
No, it's a good question.
No, I was saying I would like to know the answer.
Okay.
Yeah. So what OHA is testing are not tolerances. That term is solely EPA regulatory land. And that tolerance requires a lot of research and studies by the manufacturer to document that it can, one, be used on that plant, and two, if you're talking about an apple, how much residue can be on that apple when you consume it, both from the acute right now in the moment and over the course of your lifetime. And how much do we say is acceptable risk for you to consume that chemical from that amount of residue on the apple over the course of your lifetime? And then they take into account special populations like pregnant women, elderly folks who don't process chemicals as well in their bodies, or the example I like to use is apple juice, right? That's going to concentrate it. And so it typically has a different tolerance than the raw apple itself. And it might be based on the fact that my kid would drink his weight in apple juice every day if I let him, versus the fact that I would have, a cup or two in the winter from my dad's cider press. And so they're going to factor in extra, they're going to reduce that tolerance by an extra factor for that kid, and the fact that the kid's smaller and going to have potentially more exposure to the concentrated chemical in the apple juice. So that's a tolerance. The action levels that OHA has set are just for market access. They tried to come up with numbers maybe that might match tolerances that EPA has established, but the whole reason that they established them is because it's been a federally illegal crop. The EPA hasn't done any of those studies, hasn't looked at potential exposure to humans, the environment, etc. And that's how you get a crop on the label.
Are they doing them for hemp now or no? Not yet.
They're in that process to go there, but it's a very slow process, and the pesticide manufacturer has to want to do it because they pay for those studies and submit all of the paperwork to the EPA to get approval to put it on the list, on the label.
Okay.
So the action levels are basically the EPA the OHA looked at pesticides that we knew folks were using on cannabis, whether it was legal or not, products that were in the marketplace and easily accessible, and then looked at the relative toxicity of those products and kind of came up with a list of products that they were concerned folks might use and think that they could get away with, and then set some levels that they feel are protective of human health. But it's not based on that rich data of studies like it would be to get on the label. And so we are working from that, and it's market access. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if it's below that action level that it's not there. It doesn't mean that it's safe to consume. It just means that they feel that it is not of such a risk that we are going to prohibit it from entering the marketplace. Go ahead, Elin.
Yeah, so I think just to add on with the question, so when those action levels were established, to what extent did Oregon look to California, for example, which has a far more robust science-based approach normally with pesticides? I don't know about with the cannabis stuff, but normally with pesticides, because it's kind of a shot in the dark on, hey, it makes sense action level wise, but wouldn't it be good to have consistency to look at that? And let's say an action level are they like a 1/10 of what a tolerance might be? And it gets back to this idea of end process. Yes, does it concentrate? Does it, because it's sticky, is it more there? Is it all of that kind of stuff? But to try to get at, I think this questionnaire folks are asking to say, hey, at the end product, if we're just basing the you're in or out on an action level that isn't as good as we have, so it's good we at least have something, otherwise it would be kicked out completely. But is there a better way to maybe get at that through, I'll just suggest, and this may be opening a can of worms, coordination with other states that are doing this until EPA has time to get around to the full tolerance deal. And my assumption is with the size of the crops, we're just going to be talking IR4 mostly, other than biopesticides that are exempt from tolerance. So anyway,
so I posted the original report way back in the day that they created the 59 analytes. I put it in the chat box. To your comment, Elin, about California and all of that, last year, Oregon Health Authority went through a year-long process of looking at all of their testing requirements, not just pesticides, but should we have heavy metals, which they added, and some of the other stuff. And they looked at California. They looked at what other states were doing for those action levels, and California, I think it's like 0.1 for everything or something. They do break it out some based on how the product's used, because, when we eat something, we change it and break it down versus inhaling it into our lungs and having it go directly into our bloodstream. And so I think they have done some of that. The folks on that group looked at all of that and said, they came up with, we don't think that's any better than what we have. So, they've kind of looked at that, but I think it's not the levels themselves necessarily as when, like Giovanna's talking about, when it's tested or when they decide that it's kicked out. It's problematic to test the final product only, because if you have a brownie, those chemicals may be perfectly legal on the flour or the sugar or the milk or the butter. You end up potentially bringing pesticide residues into that product. Marianne, your question earlier about other crops, no, we don't do other crops like that. And part of that is because we have the EPA tolerance process, and because we aren't taking a formerly illicit crop and trying to bring them into our legal. So those are the arguments that have been made. your question about IR4, I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's a I think it's a grant funded by the federal government to some universities, and they work on pesticide studies for minor crops, because pesticide manufacturers are less inclined to study the use of a chemical on a minor crop because they're not going to have as much sold as they would if they were using it on corn, cotton, soybeans. So thank you. Jeff just put a copy of the definition in the chat as well.
I don't
And
have access to the chat. Is anyone else
Sure.
experiencing that?
Are you through your internet browser? Because I think that can happen when you go through your browser as opposed to the app.
Yeah. So real quick, before you ask that question, Marianne, for folks looking at the recording afterwards, the IR4 project helps specialty crop growers address pest management concerns so they can produce healthy crops. And the crop protection industry focuses their efforts on major crops, leaving specialty crop growers with fewer tools for effectively managing the pests. They develop the data necessary to get those products registered through the EPA, and they also support registration of specialty uses on some major crops. So just kind of an idea of what that IR4 group does.
Yeah, it's a good program, and a lot of the Aggies who coordinate on the federal side make sure that in the funding apparatus that there's funding that's adequate there.
And it's really important for Oregon, where we grow 220 some odd crops, because most of those are specialty crops.
And it's not only how much sold, it's also the liability of the impact of a problem on the crop too, that is a consideration that detours some of the specialty crops from having the manufacturer pursue a tolerance. So
thank you for that, Elin. So Marianne, did you have a?
Yeah, and I think it's somewhat related to this universe of what we're talking about. Sunny, I don't know if you know this, but how far off are OHA's action levels from like the minimum detection levels of like what you can even detect on the commodity? Like, are they basically the same, or is there detection level down here and the standard up here? Okay.
Yeah. So let me, especially since I know Giovanna's not able to see. So hopefully you can see this. So this is the list, and I think these levels are all still the same. Again, this report is very old, and this list is in the OHA rules. So you're seeing things like 0.4, 0.2, but like some of the pyrethroids are 1. You know, I think some of them, I think there might be a sequinistocele, I apologize, is 2 parts per million. Oxamil is 1. So it can kind of vary, but I know our lab frequently can go down to 0.01 parts per million, 0.1. Which is it, Toby? I'm sorry.
You're right, 0.01 ppm.
Yeah. So that doesn't mean that all of the private labs, the private labs are the ones that are doing this. They have to be within a certain level of this. Some of them don't go lower because they don't want to document that it might be on material at a lower level. Because that was another thing OHA looked at, was were labs consistently, you know, able to document it at a lower level. Many of them don't have their level of quantification set super low. They have it, you know, they obviously have it set below the action level, but there's not a lot of incentive for them to set it super low, and it becomes more expensive.
The science in this is really advanced, and so a lot of the old standards, they couldn't put it down to that micro level. And so yeah, if you lower the denominator, you're gonna find more, right? So I mean, or raise it, whatever. I'm political science, not science. So but I mean, that's really the part that, just keep in mind that all things being equal, you look at kind of the relative human health component. That's, every time you mention OHA, I get a shiver down my spine, because they want in this game. and I don't want them here. We regulate it. I mean, you should consult. But boy, oh boy, I don't want some of those yahoos making policy. We saw enough of that with the heat and smoke
COVID.
rule and COVID. Yeah. So anyway, nice editorial. I'll stop talking.
Giovanna?
For perspective too, and I know this is a can of worms, as many things are with this plant, but just based on what Sunny was presenting, this changes for every state. So if there is anyone who is selling outside of Oregon, that is a completely different territory. What I had initially raised my hand for, I guess, is to also provide a little bit of perspective in relation to if we went through OHA or EPA or IR4 or what have you, what we're seeing isn't what is being sprayed on the plant. It is coming from, say, so if we're in Southern Oregon, we're looking at spray that's coming from pear orchards. If we're in Woodburn, we're looking at grass seed issues. So it's all over the place. And I don't know that there's a solution, because those tests that may be run through EPA, by whomever, that isn't always the problem, because that's not what's getting sprayed. So there are these intricate, elements that go into this issue. We obviously aren't going to have a solution today, but I just like to throw it into the ring, because the more brains there are to think about it holistically, I think we can get closer to a solution.
Thank you, Giovanna. Elin?
Yeah, and I would just add, this goes back an awfully long way when I was at DPR in California, but part of the reason why I think, and I can find out after the fact why California may have done across the board, is what Giovanna's point is, that there is, because of dust particles, because of lots of different things, there's just, when I saw aldicarb on the list, where is aldicarb used in the state of Oregon? It's not.
Yeah.
So, it's probably on the multi-residue screen. Of course, it was Timic and watermelons 25 years ago in California. So that was the big issue. So, I think, again, OHA, I think I hope in the best interest of health, kind of took a look at a lot of this, but again, consistency with other states and other things. I do think this is something that needs to stay in the purview of ODA, and can, I think in cooperation with some other states, and maybe advance the national effort faster for IR4, for everybody else, if everybody kind of works together to make this make some more sense. So I'll just add that extra 2 cents.
Thank you. So Giovanna, I just sent you a copy of the link to that report since.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah. So maybe this is a great conversation. I don't want to detract from that, but going back to coexistence and education and outreach efforts, I think it sounds like there might be some other places where we could all put our energy, because I know we're all spread in a million different directions, to try and work with and educate and bring those hemp and marijuana growers into the agricultural fold, so to speak, and then revisit this. And we can, perfectly happy to continue having some of those other conversations, but from a coexistence perspective, I don't think we have enough information to indicate that we need to put together the kind of effort that we did for wine grapes and grass seed. I think we can, when Anne's doing some of her general drift outreach and education stuff, she can loop me in so that I can send it out to the hemp grower list. And then maybe we can do some targeted outreach about everybody is subject to the same requirements in this state. And if you know, ODA can't help you if we don't know that there's a problem. So be sure and let us know sooner rather than later, et cetera. So we could do some of that kind of outreach. Marianne and then Giovanna.
I think Giovanna was first. Oh,
I
no
just
longer
forgot.
in the queue. We have some, and probably different than what you're looking at, but I guess I'd say maybe as a concurrent effort, we could kind of repurpose it and share it more broadly. We put together, at the request of our Jackson County Farm Bureau, some broad information on kind of right to farm, being a good neighbor as a farmer. And that was actually spanning from concerns they had down there of some marijuana or hemp growers that were citing, they're far enough away, I think it must have been hemp because it was next to a school, and concerns about like farming practices impacting the school. And we just did some
Remember
like,
that.
yeah, and we just did some like, hey, like, if congratulations, you're a farmer, with that comes some responsibility to be a good neighbor, and here's what that looks like. And we had pesticides in there, but also noise and dust, and just, you know, like, and this is what right to farm does and doesn't mean, and it's not this blanket exemption to do whatever you want. I could share that, but I could repurpose that on our end and resend it, or have it kind of combine with anything y'all are doing. It was really well received in there. Again, you're gonna remember the name better than me, but the committee that they have used
At the
without, which
county.
I think they still use it and hand it out to people. We did it like 2 or 3 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
And it was like a pretty little brochure thing, and our comms person had worked it up. So yeah, happy to volunteer that at any point if it feels useful as well.
Okay. So let's kind of wrap it up for today, maybe, and then we'll keep in touch and kind of keep having these conversations. Maybe next spring when session is not busy. Towards the end of session, so maybe I'm stretching the definition of spring. We can touch base and see, you know, as we're getting ready for the growing season, if that's another time to yes, Jenny, thank you. Another time to kind of target folks, you know, as we're going into the next growing season on all sides, you know, not just the cannabis, but let's be good neighbors, let's prevent drift. We grow a multitude of crops. I think I was reading a year or two ago that Iowa had issued their first drift violation. And I was like, what the heck? But I guess, you know, if you drift from corn to corn, you don't care. So, you know, it just was mind boggling to me, having come out of the Oregon system, to hear that, wow, they got their first drift violation in like 2019 or something. I don't know what their pesticide program does.
It's pretty sleepy.
Yeah.
If I can just add to that too, because from a grape standpoint, we have had this last year in particular, probably because it was a late spring, more potential phenoxy and or other issues than, and which of course may or may not be reported.
Sure.
But I think the whole thing is to just make sure you know, we emphasize education for everybody. And I'll use the example that I think I mentioned before was, you know, we've got a lot of I'm a hazelnut grower too. So we got a lot of hazelnuts growing where they never grew before. And so again, just the awareness level for sucker spraying and other things next to vulnerable crops, and because you're using kind of phenoxy based stuff there for that. So it's a directed spray. It shouldn't be a problem, but it can be given heat. So those, I think, again, just re-up the awareness, it would be great.
I would piggyback if I may. I would, if we get to a common denominator between us on this call, then I think I don't see much differential, frankly. But I think this would be worthwhile having a informational hearing at the legislative level, just to remind people kind of what's happening. Also, Marianne and Jenny and Giovanna, before you came on, I was talking about how cannabis and hemp, well, hemp has its own kind of inspection and license program. Cannabis really should be within the ODA on the growing side and not with OLCC. I want to talk to you more about kind of what that looks like, because I think the license and inspection program for cannabis, really, it should have never been at OLCC, the growing side. So I just want to talk to you about that, and maybe because I wouldn't want to step out front of this group, but I feel pretty strongly, especially when we're doing the initial rules for cannabis. It was too complicated for them to contemplate that at the time. But this program's been around long enough now, that perhaps we should talk about that.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Anything else before I give you almost 20 minutes of your time back on a Friday? I don't know about you. I'm happy for that.
You get 40 minutes worth of credit.
Oh, good. Okay. Like I said, I was recording, so I will have that recording available. I will send it out to Giovanna, Marianne, and Jenny, since you guys were here. And then if anybody else asks me for it,
Will you
I
send
will
it
be
to me
happy to share.
so I can send it to my lobby team?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. With that, thank you for your time, and we'll see you all soon. I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sunny.